Welcome to this show of the Mind-Gut Conversation series. It's a particular pleasure to have Dr. David Perlmutter as a discussion partner, and it's a real privilege, and it probably doesn't need much introduction. Dr. Perlmutter is a world-renowned author, best-selling author of several books, The Grain Brain, Brain Maker, and the latest book, The Grain Brain Whole Life Plan. He has had a major influence on dietary habits for people around the world. It's a unique opportunity to discuss some issues that are obviously of great interest and relevance for many people. I would like to preface as a scientist, I don't have any preformed opinion. I believe things as long as there is evidence to support them. And if new evidence comes along, I'll always be happy and eager to modify my own views. So that applies also to anything that has to do with diet and brain-gut health. So, Dr. Perlmutter, welcome to the show. And
well, Dr. Mayer, I am delighted to be here today, and I am very much looking forward to our time together.
Great. So let me start with an initial question. So how have your views about healthy diets evolved over the past 5 years, and particularly over the course of your 3 best-selling books? And as you write in your book, you have gone through some personal experiences related to health and disease. And has this period and this intense discussion that you have had with multiple audiences, has that in any way changed your view on optimal health, longevity, healthy aging, and so forth?
Well, the short answer is without a doubt. And has there been an evolution of my ideology over the past few years? Yes, there has been. And certainly if you were to compare what our recommendations are today versus, for example, what we were saying, probably what you might have been saying 20 years ago, they'd be very much, I think, on the opposite sides of the spectrum. Back in those days, I think many of us in healthcare, physicians, were talking about low-fat diets. And it was based upon the available information at that time. 5 years ago, when I published Grain Brain, I focused in on the need to cut back dramatically on simple carbohydrates and welcome back to the table the notion of eating good fat. And at that point, that was still a little bit conjectural, to say the least, and we received quite a bit of pushback, especially with the fat part of the story. But as you well know, with time, over the past 5 years, there has been a very good validation of the importance of good dietary fat as it relates to human health, even to the extent that the United States dietary guidelines have changed and have recognized that the number one culprit in terms of threatening our health is, in fact, the simple carbohydrates, the sugars, if you will, and processed carbohydrates. So what I think has really been one of the pivotal changes for me over the past 5 years is not really in the substance of what our recommendations are, but rather in looking at our dietary recommendations, not just in terms of the degree of fat, carbohydrates, and protein and micronutrients in the diet, percentage-wise, but more importantly, how our dietary choices are seen through the lens of the gut organisms. In other words, what do our dietary choices do in terms of the health of our gut microbiota now that we recognize that the health and diversity of the organisms living within us are playing such an important role in our health? We say that when a woman is pregnant, she's got to watch what she eats now because she's eating for 2, when each of us is eating for 100 trillion or whatever the number of organisms this week happens to be. So I think that's been the major shift, not so much in the recommendations, but I think in the perspective.
Yeah, so let's come back to the fat and to the microbiome component in a minute. I was going to start asking you sort of a key question of, one of the things that the Grain Brain really brought to the consciousness of millions of people, and that's related to gluten. And so with your crusade against gluten, started with the Grain Brain, you've obviously had a tremendous effect on eating habits of millions of people around the world. It's been estimated that 100 million Americans even pay attention or limit the intake of, or have limited the intake of gluten. And there's probably few people that have single-handedly had such an impact on eating behavior. And so you could say, well, so regardless if you believe in all the aspects of the gluten story, it certainly has had a tremendous benefit for those people suffering from celiac disease, which has been increasing worldwide. And it's made it much easier for people with that disease to have access to gluten-free food everywhere. So clearly a major impact. So my question is, do you think that the impact on people not suffering from celiac disease or on non-celiac gluten sensitivity, do you think that the impact has been equally important and significant?
I think the impact has been profound and very positive, and I'll explain why. Certainly, you would agree that a gluten-free diet is a mandatory course of action for an individual with celiac disease. That said, we're not talking about a huge number of people proportionately. We're talking about maybe 1.4 to 1.6% of the American population. Over the years, we've begun to understand that there are people who are sensitive to gluten through a different mechanism, not an autoimmune mechanism. And they've been characterized, as was recently reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association and validated, as having something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, meaning a different mechanism, a not specifically an inherited predisposition. And these individuals have a variety of intestinal and even extra-intestinal manifestation of their reaction to this protein found in wheat, barley, and rye that is called gluten. More specifically, they're probably reacting to what is called gliadin, which is a subcomponent of gluten itself. Now, beyond that, in work done by your colleague, Dr. Alessio Fasano at Harvard, there's recently been published information that tells us that gliadin, which is part of gluten, actually induces permeability in the gut of all humans. What does that mean? It means that leakiness of the gut, the loss of integrity of the gut lining happens when all humans, or that was his extrapolation, are exposed to this protein called gluten because it contains gliadin. Now, does that mean that everybody on the planet is going to have a severe and measurable reaction if they consume gluten? Not at all. Does it mean that most people can consume gluten and get away with it in terms of not having any reaction? It does. But I look upon the recommendation of going gluten-free as offloading yet another potentially worrisome risk from the camel's back. We know that if gliadin contained in gluten induces gut permeability, that makes it important, at least in my book, quite literally in my book. Why is it important? Because as you would agree, we've got to do everything we can to maintain gut wall integrity. That the increased permeability of the gut is now being linked to various autoimmune and inflammatory conditions, including many of our chronic degenerative conditions. The other issue that I'll bring up is the notion that our work tended to push the needle in terms of increasing the amount of gluten-free foods that people seem to gravitate to. And am I in favor of that? And the answer, I think, may surprise you, and that is I'm really not. And the reason I make that statement is because, when I go to the grocery store and go to the gluten-free section, the food choices that I see that people are buying are not good for your health. The gluten-free pastries, pies, cakes, breads, flour, pasta, these are foods that, while they are gluten-free, and I think that's a good thing, are nonetheless very high in carbohydrate and such work against a person's health by paving the way for insulin resistance and ultimately for type 2 diabetes.
Okay. Yeah, so I personally don't suffer from non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and actually I do love bread, not all bread, but I definitely love it when I'm traveling in Europe or go to one of the French bakeries in Los Angeles that imports their flour from France and makes it according to traditional recipes, the bread. And quite honestly, on my travels also, I ask everybody in France, when I see people coming out of the bakery 3 times a day with their fresh bread, I ask them, would you change your dietary habit based on this possibility that gluten sensitivity may play a role in. So in general, I do not get this answer except in the United States. So my key question is, do you believe this is something that has to do in a major way with the way that wheat is grown, produced, processed, and bread is made in the US, in North America, that has led to this, to this epidemic, one can call it really, of gluten sensitivity?
That's a great question. I would say that there are several points that you brought up just now that I think are very germane. And first, it is true that a lot of people indicate they don't want to give up their bread. However, if you contextualized your question in a different way by asking, would you give up your bread if it meant that perhaps your migraine headaches might improve, your irritable bowel might improve, your joint pain might reduce, your fasting blood sugar might improve, etc., I think you might get a different answer. I mean, I think it really depends on how you ask that question. I would agree that France and Italy, people seem to eat a lot of bread and seem to get away with it. But I don't think it's fair as a scientist, you would agree, I'm sure, that to look in that aspect of their diet in isolation is good science. Because the other things that we're seeing, as you know, when you go to France and you go to Italy, they're eating things that are good for their gut as well. They're eating more olive oil, more fresh fruits, more colorful fruits and vegetables, higher levels of fiber. They're drinking good wine. And those things have to be added in because those things may be actually healing for the gut and perhaps offsetting some of the damaging effects that gluten can have. By and large, the food in America is awful. I mean, I'm an American, I'm a proud American, but the food here is not ideal. The food in Europe is better. I've said that many, many times. But to get to the root of the question with respect to our cultivars that are used here in the creation of our breads, the wheat that is grown, I think one practice that is widespread in America that may well contribute to the fact that the bread here seems to be associated with more issues than it might be in Europe is the fact that our wheat here in America, by and large, is sprayed with an herbicide called glyphosate. Now, why would they do that if this is not genetically modified wheat, which it is not? Farmers here in America have now been convinced that by spraying their crops with this herbicide glyphosate, it will desiccate or dry the crops more readily. They'll be able to get them to the market quicker and have a quicker turnaround, so it'll be more profitable. So that is one reason that wheat and wheat products, which make up between 40 and 60% of the American diet, I think are much more threatening here in the United States. Do people eat bread and get away with it? Of course they do. But I would suggest that anyone you might ask may indeed have some health concerns or actual issues ongoing that possibly could improve if they were to try a gluten-restricted diet for a number of weeks. I think that kind of intervention is good science. Now, you indicated that you like your bread. I like bread. I don't eat it, but I would like it. I would eat a bowl of Haagen-Dazs every night, but I don't do it. And so it's really a question of learning about this and as a scientist and making the best decision. And beyond that, in our position, you and I, making recommendations based upon what we've learned.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get is it really has, that's sort of in my current working hypothesis, that it has more to do with the messed up food supply and food processing that is occurring in North America and possibly in England, and particularly in countries where obesity and type 2 diabetes mellitus have increased significantly, rather than with grains per se or gluten per se. I mean, we've eaten gluten the way I grew up. I mean, I grew up in a family that had a long-standing family tradition of making sweets and chocolates and bread as well. I have overdosed on that in the first 15 years of my life. People still do, and I, maybe I'm just one of those lucky people that are not affected by it, but I think it's much more likely that the ingredients, so for example, I get off the plane in Munich and the first thing I buy is these ancient grain sandwiches, or I mean, all kinds of things that are taste totally different from whatever you could buy here in a bakery. And so, it's just, as I said, it's my current working hypothesis. And I was actually going to run by a couple of, case stories that I have experienced in my practice that I've not been able to sort out, partially confirming really what I just said. So 2 people, students that went on a gluten-free diet, they were told by their physician or dietitian that the kind of symptoms, digestive symptoms that they had would benefit from it. They got better, but then they both went on an exchange program or on a semester abroad to Italy. All their symptoms disappeared. They ate everything that they could eat, including bread, pasta. And so for the 2 months they were there, they didn't have the symptoms. They came back and the symptoms came back immediately. So that kind of confirms that notion that I've developed, that it's really something unique about the North American food supply that plays a major role here. The other point that I want to make is, so I see a lot of patients that have gone on a gluten-free diet. I mean, everybody has read your book. And what they say is that they're absolutely convinced that they feel better. But their IBS symptoms, for example, irritable bowel syndrome symptoms or their digestive problems did not change at all. That's why they're still seeing me. But I've gotten this impression that a lot of people say, including some of my colleagues actually, they just feel better on a gluten-free diet. Do you have any comment on that? So,
well, you actually brought up 3 different examples, and I want to take the second example right off the bat, because that is the individuals who feel better, but nonetheless, there's no change in their IBS symptomatology when they go on a gluten-free diet. And it really gets to the crux of a publication last year that actually insinuated that there might be an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in individuals who go gluten-free. And that became, picked up by the popular press. It was actually a very good study. And what the authors concluded was there was an increased risk in the population that did go gluten-free. And the conclusion, however, was that while there was an increased risk, it was felt that the increased risk was because when people go gluten-free, they tend to avoid all grains. And as such, they reduce their dietary fiber. And you and I both know that would not be a good thing for an IBS patient. So that is a big issue that we have to confront and deal with in working through with patients what it means to be on a gluten-free diet. The last thing in the world we would ever want to do is to have people restrict their fiber. We desperately need fiber as a bulking agent, but perhaps more importantly, as a fuel for the microbiota. Having said that, that's a really important consideration and caveat that we walk through with individuals who are going gluten-free. And it really gets back to the statement about grains in general. And I am certainly not against grains. Grains, by definition, represent seeds of grass. And that includes things like rice and corn. Quinoa is not, by strict definition, a seed of a grass, but nonetheless is typically talked about when people are discussing grains, sprayed with glyphosate, and that the portions are reasonably controlled in terms of the carbohydrate content. But by all means, what needs to be factored in here is when people go gluten-free, what has been their change in terms of their dietary fiber intake. I think that your commentary on the 2 individuals who felt ill, went to Europe, went gluten-free, went to Europe, came back, felt well in Europe, and then felt ill again coming back to the States, very much is supportive of what we've talked about earlier, and that is how health-threatening the foods are here in America. It's scary business that, by and large, what you eat in most public restaurants, venues, when you travel, et cetera, it's food that it's threatening to a person's health. And again, we see that, while there are less desirable foods in Europe in general, it just seems to me, as you've experienced, that the food there and certainly in Asia as well can be very, very good. Having said that, we certainly see changes happening with degradation of food quality, certainly in Asia and secondarily in Europe, that is right in lockstep with increasing rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes and chronic degenerative conditions, as the world becomes westernized in its food choices and availability.
Yeah, so I guess we pretty much agree on that point. Let's move on to another topic, which is also kind of somewhat controversial depending on whom you talk to. And so in your books, you promote a high fat, high meat, low carb diet. And you're not alone with this. You're joined by prominent scientists, Dr. Robert Lustig, David Ludwig, and others that also promote this kind of a diet. But there's, as you know, there's another camp of also very prominent people that have really been promoting predominantly plant-based diets, not just the Mediterranean style diets, but also, vegetarian and vegan. And clearly the evidence in support of those is equally good as it is for a diet that is sort of more towards the ketogenic paleo end of the spectrum. I've sort of been impressed both by my personal experiences in Italy and interacting with Italian winemakers and people that are in the food business. How can an ordinary person follows these cultural battles? So depending on which book you pick in a bookstore, both professors, both reputable individuals, both citing a litany of studies that support the health benefits of their approach.
Very, very good question. And, recently, several months ago, I chaired a panel in New York at a conference which attempted to answer that question. What should you eat? And we had representatives from various camps who, like you say, were very adept at arguing their point based upon the literature. And I think that first, as a point of clarification, never in my history nor in any of my books have I advocated eating a lot of meat. So I want to make that clear. Eating a lot of good fat is certainly different from the idea of eating a lot of meat. So I think that by and large, the best diet for humans is mostly vegetarian, a colorful array of vegetables on the plate with some other fiber-rich forms of food. If a person chooses to eat animal protein, that is certainly available under some specific guidelines. So already then that brings us closer to those who would say a more plant-based diet is the best thing for humans. I agree with that. So we just covered a lot of ground in the past 90 seconds that you realize that what Dr. Perlmutter is talking about is I'm not digging my heels in with a sort of an Atkins diet for the age for now, but rather recognizing that we've eaten plants for a long, long time, as that would be what the paleo group would advocate, along with meat. And that, I would also indicate that when you look at the studies that tend to castigate meat, studies that you're very familiar with in terms of eating red meat showing perhaps an increased associative risk for colon cancer. Do I agree with that data? 100%. I think it's dead on accurate. What I disagree with is the extrapolation of that data, the China study type data, to include all meat, because that's where the data came from. The data comes from, do you eat a lot of meat, on these food questionnaires, and then what was the risk of developing whatever it may be, colon cancer or other issues that are associated with meat consumption. We've got to be very specific in terms of what we're talking about here, i.e., you could do a study determining if a person drinks alcohol or not, and not delineate between a Bordeaux and drinking a couple of shots of really cheap scotch each day, right? And you're just saying we're looking at alcohol globally. You can't do it. Meat, the quality of meat generally that people consume in the United States that enters into these studies is horrendous. It is from cattle that have been fed genetically modified food sprayed with glyphosate. These cattle are treated with hormones and antibiotics. I wouldn't go anywhere near that. But on the other hand, if you choose to eat red meat and have a serving of grass-fed beef once a week, have at it. Eating some wild salmon, for example, free-range chicken, I think is reasonable. Eggs from free-range chicken, very high in good types of fats, high in good fat called cholesterol, which is important for us, high in lecithin, et cetera, B vitamins. I think that's reasonable. I think we've got to be very careful about drawing conclusions from these broad studies that aren't real specific. So I think the take-home message is that we should eat less refined carbohydrates. I can't imagine very many people are going to argue with that. I think that, yes, many of us now are advocating higher levels of good fat while getting rid of the dangerous modified vegetable oils that are so pervasive in the human diet, recognizing that things like extra virgin organic olive oil turns out to be a really good food choice. I'm certain you're familiar with the Predimed study that demonstrated beyond the Mediterranean diet, the addition of 1 liter of extra virgin olive oil, pure fat, to the diet was associated with a 40% further reduction in risk for dementia, a similar reduction in risk for breast cancer, for example. So some fats are bad. And when I say a high-fat diet, people get the willies because we all learn that fat is the enemy. Well, again, not all fat is the enemy.
But I think, I think we're pretty close together in our opinion on this.
Absolutely.
But, what I've noticed in the discussions with proponents of the high-fat diet, people don't really make a clear distinction. They always talk about high good fat, but it always implies, yes, meat is a good source of fat, and milk is, and animal products are. There's no question, the health benefits of olive oil or avocados or nuts. I mean, there's a lot of plant-based foods that have high contents of fat, and I think that it's unequivocal, the studies, that is the diet that provides the most health benefit, that is rich in those ingredients for a variety of things, from colon cancer to fatty liver to type 2 diabetes and possible neurological diseases. It's just, and I was going to mention that my personal experience. So I don't get the feeling that you're really a proponent of the ketogenic or the paleo diets. And I was just going to say one comment on that in my own personal travel. So I was fortunate when I was in college to be part of several film expeditions to primal people around the world, particularly the Yanomami and the Asmat people in Irian Jaya and New Guinea. And so we lived with these people and we observed their dietary habits. And yes, they do eat some meat, not much, even though they're surrounded by wild animals in the jungle. But that meat probably has 0% fat in it because it's wild game, it's birds, it's fish, it's small animals, running around in the jungle. They're a completely different animal, literally, and so using that term, than the animals that we get our products from. And I think this notion that our ancestors, evolved, that our whole digestive machinery in our organism, high amounts of meat and fat, I just don't think there's good evidence for that argument, that a lot of people, in the paleo or certainly the ketogenic diet is even more extreme. I don't think our bodies have evolved to have this as the predominant food.
I think that you and I see very much eye to eye on everything we've talked about so far. Our ancestors, I think, predominantly as hunter-gatherers, were eating mostly vegetables, mostly things that they could find on trees or on the ground. And if they were to stumble upon an animal or fortunate enough to kill it, then they would consume that meat, which you're right, was low in fat, but was very, very low in omega-6 and higher in omega-3. So, actually a good fat. I would also say that, the notion of being on a ketogenic diet, I don't think our ancestors actively pursued a ketogenic diet, but as you well know, being caloric restricted produces ketosis in humans as a fail-safe mechanism, as a backup mechanism. So, there were clearly times of caloric scarcity in our heritage. And the fact that we could revert to being able to burn our own body fat as a fuel source, i.e., become in ketosis, I think allowed you and me to have this conversation today, i.e., it preserved humanity. We still have that ability. We still have the ability to flip ourselves into ketosis. What the keto movement is doing now is looking at the use of not only caloric restriction, higher fat, lower carb diet, but also the use of various supplements to push ourselves into ketosis, like the use of, for example, medium chain triglyceride oil. And I think that the science behind those ideas of entering ketosis is profound, with new studies demonstrating reversal of both type 1 and type 2 diabetes in individuals put on a ketogenic diet, dramatic effects on cognition and memory. Even the work of Dr. Thomas Seyfried at NYU looking at using a ketogenic diet as an adjunct treatment for cancer. Also the work of Dr. Walter Longo looking at that as well. So I think the notion of getting us into ketosis emulates a state that humans have been in for a long, long time. And, certainly even emulates what all humans are in who are breastfed for the first 6 months of their lives.